In the news tonight, His Majesty the King holds talks with Russia's president on the region and Syria during a trip to Moscow tomorrow. The Royal Court Chief begins consultations with lower house deputies on naming the next Prime Minister. And the European Union urges Israel to ease the plight of thousands of Palestinians in Israeli jails. Good evening and welcome to the news at 10. His Majesty the King begins a two-day working visit to Russia tomorrow. He will hold talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Middle East issues, namely Syria and Jordanian-Russian ties. Khal has this profile on Jordanian-Russian relations.
Diplomatic relations between Jordan and Russia have been evolving since the two countries established ties about half a century ago. The regular visits by the two countries' leaders over the past years had largely given cooperation a boost in various fields and levels. Amman and Moscow maintained a robust dialogue on regional issues as both concur on the Middle East peace process and a political solution to the Syrian crisis. Trade and economic cooperation was given a shot in the arm after the two countries set up a special intergovernmental committee in 1993 to promote bilateral trade and investment. A political cooperation agreement was also signed in 2004.
We signed 8 agreements with the Russians in addition to 10 to 11 protocols and work programs. These took the two countries' friendship to new levels of strength. When His Majesty the King goes to Moscow, he goes to friends who know well Jordan and the nature of his politics.
Added to the cooperation deals is the opening of a Russian pilgrim's house at the baptism site in the Jordan Valley that further boosted tourism. Over 80,000 Russian tourists visit Jordan every year. Khal for the news at 10.
His Majesty the King and visiting U.S. Senator Marco Rubio discussed Jordanian-U.S. ties and developments in the region. King Abdullah and the American senator also talked about prospects to further boost cooperation between the two countries. Foreign Minister Nasser Judeh also briefed the American senator on Jordan's reforms, saying consultations are currently underway with the lower house to form the country's first parliamentary government. Rubio, a Republican senator from Florida, called the reforms a success story that won wide recognition. Judeh and the U.S. senator agreed that every possible effort should be made to kickstart Palestinian-Israeli peace talks. They also called for a peaceful solution to the Syrian crisis to stop the bloodshed, and they talked about Jordan's efforts to cope with a huge exodus of Syrian refugees. And we stay with our local news. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour met Independent Elections Commission, the IEC President Abdel Ilah Al-Khatib, and Board of Commissioners. He congratulated the IEC for its success in overseeing and managing last month's parliamentary elections. The Commission, he said, had made remarkable efforts to ensure free and transparent polls. The Prime Minister said his government was keen not to interfere in the electoral process, but had lent the IEC its full support to carry out its job. Khatib said the country should build on its achievements, adding that the parliamentary polls were an opportunity to update election-related legislation. Meantime, the Prime Minister said the government's performance is now more under scrutiny than ever, and every official is to account for any practice or behavior. He spoke at a workshop organized by the Ombudsman Bureau and the World Bank on updating cooperation and coordination between the Ombudsman's Bureau and public administration. He said the Bureau is carrying the key role of monitoring public administration performance and enhancing integrity, transparency, equality and justice, and public confidence in state institutions.
Any real reform process only aims to achieve best standards of good governance based on supremacy of the law, transparency, clarity, and social ethical values. Reform is a national cooperative responsibility. Reform in general and the revamp of public administration in particular has, since His Majesty King Abdullah assumed power, been one of the key goals he had called for and worked to achieve in this context. Then came His Majesty's order for setting up the Royal Committee for enhancing the integrity system with the aim of upgrading the national integrity system to build on achievements and press ahead to bolster public confidence in the state and its institutions and enhance reassurance for citizens.
Royal Court Chief Faiz al-Tarawni kicked off talks with lawmakers to choose a Prime Minister who will head the Kingdom's first parliamentary government. After opening the 17th Parliament, His Majesty the King tasked Tarawni with the consultations with the Lower House as the new mechanism of choosing a Prime Minister that will usher in an era of parliamentary governments. Tarawni started the consultations with Al-Watan bloc, which has 28 seats. Watan's chief, Atif al-Tarawni, said his bloc blessed the King's move as it recognized his aim to bring all Jordanians into the decision-making process and formation of governments. He said his bloc wanted to see a new head of government known for his professionalism and integrity with a clear agenda to move reforms forward. A series of other meetings will follow with the remaining blocs, starting with bigger blocs and ending up with independent lawmakers. The Royal Court Chief said the King will be kept posted on the outcome and lawmakers' agendas and thoughts. Jordan and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, signed an agreement to set up a headquarters for the bank in Amman. The deal was sealed by Minister of Planning and International Cooperation Jafar Hassan and Huld Agar-Jaki, Director of the bank's South and East Mediterranean region. Hassan said the European Bank's new headquarters is a key step for cooperation as the bank will soon start operations in the region. He said the EBRD had set up a €1 billion investment fund to cover its operations in Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia and Morocco, and the amount will be raised to €2.5 billion to finance projects in the 4 countries. The minister said 80% of the bank's operations is directed to the private sector. Other bank priorities, he added, include adopting financial solutions to infrastructure projects, developing capital markets and encouraging sustainable energy efficiency and water ventures, as well as small and medium enterprise.
This agreement today allows us not only to open a permanent office, but also to hire subsequent colleagues on the ground. Most of them will be Jordanian, with their local knowledge to operate in your country. We are focused on the private sector. We will work very closely with the government on SME programs. We will finance not only the private sector in Amman, but we want to go into the region. We support outside of the capital.
Jordanian border guard are struggling to cope with a dramatic exodus of Syrian refugees into the kingdom. Up to 1,300 refugees had entered through border points in the last 24 hours. A source at the Armed Forces General Command said the new arrivals were of various age groups, including many injured and sick people. The military guard escorted the refugees to makeshift accommodation centers on the border, where they received urgent humanitarian aid before moving to the Zaatri refugee camp. The border guard have reported an unprecedented surge in refugees crossing in recent weeks, with a daily average of 2,000. European Union governments agreed to renew sanctions against Syria for 3 months. United Nations investigators said they had a list of Syrian leaders identified as suspected war criminals. Syria, for the first time, has offered to hold direct negotiations with rebel forces it long dismissed as terrorists. Luaib Al-Qar reports.
President Bashar al-Assad says he is confident his troops will win the conflict ravaging Syria. His latest remark comes amid new calls for the International Criminal Court to launch a probe into war crimes. The United Nations Security Council referred high political and military suspects to the International Criminal Court in The Hague to prosecute those responsible for war crimes and other abuses committed in nearly 2 years of conflict. United Nations human rights investigator Carla Del Ponte said the violence in Syria is worsening and aggravated by the increased sectarianism.
Yes, it's time to react now after 2 years. It's incredible that the Security Council don't take a decision. And I must more explicitly than Paolo, I would say the deferral of justice must be imminent, urgently, because crimes are continuing committed in Syria, and the number of victims are increasing day to day. So justice must be done.
A report into the crisis called on the Security Council to act urgently to ensure accountability for grave violations. European Union governments agreed to extend sanctions against Syria for 3 months. But they said they would amend an arms embargo to provide more non-lethal support and technical assistance to protect civilians, while tightening economic sanctions against Damascus.
I think there is a broader range of equipment that we could give to them. That's the sort of thing that we need to discuss with them. Of course, it's very important that any such support does not go to extremist groups. In Syria, one of the reasons for supporting the coalition would be to avoid that happening.
The EU diplomats said several scenarios were under consideration in terms of what help could be offered to Syrian rebels. One possibility would be to allow some shipments to areas under rebel control. On the battlefront, government forces carried out shelling and airstrikes across Syria, including Aleppo, Damascus, Daraa, Homs and Idlib. The rebel fighters seized a checkpoint on a road leading to Aleppo International Airport north of the country. There was also heavy fighting in the capital Damascus, causing a major power failure. Loy Balkar for the news at 10.
And over to Palestine. Palestinians protested throughout the West Bank and Gaza, calling for the release of prisoners from Israeli jails. The EU called on the government of Israel to allow for the immediate restoration of their family visiting rights. It also called for the full respect of international human rights obligations towards all Palestinian detainees and prisoners. Laith Shanqiti has the story.
International voices are calling for Israel to ease the agony of Palestinians held in its jails and stop arbitrary measures. Palestinian prisoners have long complained of maltreatment and poor conditions, as well as the difficulty of securing family visits and the invasive searches visiting relatives have to go through. The European Union's representative in Jerusalem said Israel should improve the conditions of thousands of Palestinian detainees. It followed an appeal by the Palestinian Authority for international intervention.
The High Representative Catherine Ashton is following with deep concern reports of the deteriorating health conditions of 4 Palestinian prisoners who are currently on hunger strike in Israeli jails. We have called for the restoration of full family visiting rights in line with international human rights obligations, which should be extended to all Palestinian prisoners and detainees. As we have said before, we are concerned about the extensive use of administrative detention by the Israelis.
Palestinians clashed with Israeli police in many cities across the West Bank in a show of solidarity with the detainees. Palestinian Minister for Prison Affairs, Issa Karaka, said public protests to show solidarity with hunger strikers would be held all week.
With every day that passes, the hunger strikers get closer to the danger of martyrdom. This is also in accordance with medical reports that have been registered. As for the communication, the contacts are continuing. As the brothers in Egypt say, they are in touch with the Israeli side, but until now the Israelis are stubborn. The European Union and Quartet Representative Office have informed us that they are also communicating with the Israeli authorities.
Physicians for Human Rights Israel, a non-government organization, has regularly monitored the health of the prisoners on hunger strike.
2 of the detainees are on hunger strike for 83 days at the moment, and the situation is deteriorating. They refuse to cooperate with the authorities and to get any supplements and so on. The other 2 are on hunger strike even longer than that. We don't have full information about them, but we are concerned from the fact that their situation is deteriorated, at least.
Palestinian Prisoners Club, an advocacy group for Palestinians jailed by Israel, said international efforts aimed at negotiating an end to the hunger strikes with Israel have so far been futile. Nearly 5,000 Palestinians are held in Israeli jails, many charged with involvement in attacks on Israelis. Laith Shanqiti for the news at 10.
And over to Iraq. Al-Qaeda's Iraqi wing claimed responsibility for car bomb blasts that killed 28 people in Shia districts in the capital, Baghdad. The Al-Qaeda affiliate Islamic State of Iraq and other groups opposed to Prime Minister Noor al-Maliki's government, which they accuse of discriminating against the country's Sunni minority. At least 8 car bombs exploded near shops, restaurants in Baghdad's busy commercial streets. One blast tore off shop fronts in Kayara district, while another left the remains of a car littered across a high street in the busy commercial Karrada district. Insurgents are stepping up attacks at a time when Maliki is facing 2 months of protests by thousands of Sunnis in western provinces who accuse his government of marginalizing them. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said North Korea's latest nuclear test is proof the world must keep up pressure on Iran to prevent it acquiring atomic weapons. He told a gathering of international Jewish leaders sanctions alone could not stop Iran developing a nuclear bomb. Despite 4 rounds of United Nations sanctions, Iran has defied international demands to scale back uranium enrichment. The United States and some of its Western allies share Israel's suspicion that Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapon capability under the guise of a civilian atomic energy program. Netanyahu held out the prospect of military action as a last resort.
Sanctions alone will not stop the nuclear program of Iran. They have to be coupled with a robust, credible military threat. If they're not, there's no chance to stop it. If they're coupled with that military threat, there is a chance to stop it. And if it doesn't stop it that way, then it'll have to be stopped another way.
In Nigeria, a group linked to Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for kidnapping 7 foreigners in an attack in a remote Nigerian town. Raiders used explosives to blast their way into a housing compound in a hail of gunfire. The gunmen killed a security guard and abducted 4 Lebanese workers, a Briton, an Italian and a Greek, after storming the compound of a Lebanese construction firm in Jamari in Boshi State. The remaining foreign workers abandoned their homes and fled to safer areas. Police said they were intensifying efforts to track down the kidnappers in the areas around Jamari, a remote town north of the capital, Abuja. Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez made a surprise return from Cuba, where he had surgery for cancer. Chavez has spent more than 2 months in Cuba for the surgery that has jeopardized his 14-year rule of the South American OPEC member. His homecoming implies some medical improvement, as supporters hope he could return to active rule. Yet there was no new information on his state nor images of his arrival, and aides say his condition remains complex. We stay in Venezuela. Venezuelans are using laughter yoga therapy to combat the stress of life in the country's chaotic capital city. Therapy begins with a brief warming up period, followed by face exercises and laughter. Participants are encouraged to look into the eyes of other participants and watch them laughing, as the idea that laughter is contagious and unconditional is a basic premise for laughter yoga's philosophy. As it's in other countries, the laughter yoga sessions are held free of charge and are often held in parks or other public spaces. Studies have found that humor therapy is as effective as widely used antipsychotic drugs in managing agitation and stress. China completed another successful weekend at the latest freestyle skiing World Cup aerials in the Russian resort of Sochi. In the men's event, Guangguo Qi and Zhongqing Liu finished first and second respectively, with Belarusian Denis Osipov. The competition was badly affected by fog before the start of the final. The big story in the men's competition was the failure of overall World Cup leader Zhongyang Jia to advance past the final stage. He landed on his back in an early run and missed out. In the women's event, overall World Cup leader Meng Tu-Shu staged a remarkable turnaround to win a 5th title in 6 events. Australia's Laura Peel finished second, with Swiss Tanya Scher in third. And over to tennis. Victoria Azarenka showed that being second best was not an option for her as she outclassed Serena Williams 7-6, 2-6, 6-6, 3 to win the Qatar Open. Williams had entered the match on a high after reclaiming the top ranking for the 6th time and beating rival Maria Sharapova in the semi-finals. Azarenka celebrated winning her 2nd successive Qatar title. And a look at the weather outlook. Cold, partly cloudy to cloudy tonight, with a chance for scattered showers in the northern and central Jordan and moderate winds. Tomorrow, relatively cold and cloudy in most parts of the country, with a chance for rain and light winds. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect a relatively cold night and a pleasant day tomorrow, with moderate to brisk winds and calm seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. And to close, here's a reminder of our top stories. His Majesty the King holds talks with Russia's president on the region and Syria during a trip to Moscow tomorrow. The Royal Court Chief begins consultations with Lower House deputies on naming the next Prime Minister. And the European Union urges Israel to ease the plight of thousands of Palestinians in Israeli jails. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of the news. I am Ra'ad Liptoush. Thank you for watching and have a good night.